Hey everyone, so I have a few minutes and I just wanted to do a video on how to start using your DSLR in manual settings. The reason I wanted to do this video is because that's how I learned how to use my DSLR several years ago. Just one really good YouTube video that explained it. I watched it like 3 times and then I would fiddle around with my camera and then I'd watch the video again. And that's how I learned, and I've been doing it ever since, and it was really helpful. So I'm going to take my attempt at also trying to explain it in the simplest way I can, because I know that it's really overwhelming when you're first starting. So there's only 3 things that you need to know. There are 3 settings that will get you into manual mode. There's a lot more later that you could do for fine tuning, but just to start, 3 things. And that will get you almost to control your camera. So photography and your settings, it's 100% about light. That is the key to everything. So when you're setting your settings, you're telling your camera how much light to let into the camera. So you have 3 things, like I mentioned. You have your ISO, your aperture, and your shutter speed. And these 3 things work together, and each one has pros and cons. So we're going to start with shutter speed. Shutter speed is the sound that you hear when you're clicking on your camera. You hear it open and shut. It opens and shuts really quick. When you have a very fast shutter speed, it's like instant, like, and when it's a slow shutter speed, you could leave it open. You could leave it open for several minutes if you have it on a tripod, or I don't know, it really just depends on what you're trying to capture. So the shutter speed, while it's open, it will capture light and movement. So if you have a very slow shutter speed, you're going to let in a lot of light while it's open. And while it's open, you're also going to capture any movement in front of the camera. So the good part is, with a slower shutter speed, you're letting in more light. But the bad part is you're capturing motion blur. So if you're getting blurry pictures, it's because your shutter speed is too slow. You need it to be faster. You want it open for a shorter amount of time. You want it really rapid. So if you're doing sports photography, you're going to want a really fast shutter speed. The downside of a really fast shutter speed is that you're not letting in as much light. So it's a balance. So you can kind of imagine it like a curtain. The curtain opens. While it's open, you see everything. The light comes in, the movement comes in, and then it closes. So a good general rule of thumb is leave it as slow as you can while not getting motion blur. So you can let in lots of light, but you're not going to get blurry photos. And also, this is why you see a lot of blurry photos in low light settings, because you're like if you're on your phone and clicking on your phone, it's because the camera's trying to let in more light so that it can get a good photo, a properly exposed photo. And the only solution for this is to either manually set your settings or to add more light to your environment. Okay, so the next thing is your ISO. So ISO, it helps me to think of it this way, even though people will pick apart this thought process, but it's more or less like fake light. It's artificial light. So the good part is the higher the ISO you have, the more light that it brings in, but also the more grain you get. So you're going to have brighter photos, but you're risking grainy photos. So that's another reason why in low light settings you might get grainy photos. So the good general rule of thumb is leave this number as low as you can. And I leave mine by default at like 100, and then I just bump it up if after I set my aperture and shutter speed. If I need more light, then the ISO starts going up. Now, certain cameras can handle a higher ISO better than others, but that's like a whole different lesson. Just as a general rule of thumb, keep it as low as you can. The next setting we're going to talk about now is aperture. This is the last one. So aperture is, I'm trying to think of an analogy. It's kind of on the lens, it's like the f/whatever number. So the lower the number is, the wider open your lens becomes. And the wider it is, it's responsible for your depth of field. So the wider it is, the more light it lets in, and the blurrier your background is going to be, the more narrow your depth of field is. So the depth of field is how much of the photo will be in focus. So if you have a really narrow depth of field, it might be like in inches in focus. And if you have a really wide depth of field, you could have a really long range that's in focus. So the higher the number is, it's a little confusing. The higher the number is, the smaller the hole is, and the less light it lets in, and the more range it's going to capture. So less things will be blurry. Less things will be blurry, less light will come in, and you'll have a higher number, a bigger number. Like f22 is like a really high number that most people will not use. F8 is like a common like sunset setting, like a famous sunset setting, so that you can get, a lot in focus. And if you're doing portraiture, you might be shooting at like f2. So f2 is going to be really wide, and when you're at the lowest your camera can go, it's called wide open. You're shooting wide open. So the f number is really small, like 1 or 2, or like 1.2 or 2 or something. It's letting in a ton of light, and it's giving you a really narrow depth of field, and that means, one little thing is going to be in focus and everything else is going to be blurry. So more or less, what I usually do, the first thing I do is I start with my shutter speed. I figure out what is the lowest my shutter speed can go and keep my photos sharp. So if I'm doing like photographing a kid, also your shutter speed is going to depend on like what lens you're using. It gets, there's a lot of details. I'm trying not to get too like complicated. But so at first I determine my shutter speed, and I figure out how fast does my shutter speed need to be to prevent blurry photos. And I always err on the side of caution. I make it a little bit faster than I think I need because I don't want to risk blurry photos. So say I'm photographing just my kids like playing in the yard, and say I'm on like a 80 millimeter or 85 millimeter lens. Let's say 50 millimeter lens, because the shorter your lens is, the more the slower your shutter speed can be. Like, just think of it like this way: like your big lenses, they move around, they're heavy, they're big, they move around, they need a little bit faster shutter speed so that you're not getting movement. So let's say we're on a 50 millimeter lens, and I'll probably choose a shutter, and I'm photographing my kids in the front yard, and they're not like running around super fast, they're just kind of like sitting around playing with chalk or something. I'll probably pick for me, I'd probably pick like 1/200, just to be safe, but I could probably go a little bit slower than that. That's just like my cautionary, or my cautiousness, I guess. And if you're outside, there's a ton of light, and then I'll have a lot of wiggle room with my other settings. So the first thing I'm gonna do, figure out what my shutter speed could be. I could probably do like 1/125 and be fine. But I'm gonna go 1/200 by default. The next setting I'm gonna pick is my aperture. And for that, I mostly just go off how big do I want my depth of field to be? How blurry do I want my backgrounds? Typically, I like a pretty blurry background, unless there's some reason I don't like if I'm photographing the moon, or the stars, I use a really high f-stop. But for like kids and portraiture and most things, I'll use a narrow depth of field. I want a blurry background. I'm probably going to go around f2. Even if I have a lens that could go lower, I don't like going so low that like your eyes in focus and your ears out of focus. I don't tend to like that as much for my style. But some people do. So I'll probably pick around f2. At that point, all I have left is my ISO. So next I'm going to pick my ISO. My ISO, I'm probably going to pick around, sorry, I'm thinking, so I'm like not looking at the camera, I'm like whatever. But my ISO, as I said, I'll start with around ISO 100. Now at this point, I have a low ISO. I have a low aperture, which is letting in a lot of light and giving me a blurry background. I have a pretty slow shutter speed, which is going to make sure I have no motion blur, and it's not going to let in a lot of light. But when you're outside, there's so much light that this is still going to be a blown out photo. So at that point, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my shutter speed and I'm just going to increase it so that I can let in even less light. So I'll probably maybe end up at like 1/2000 or something. And so I'll just keep increasing my shutter speed. And sometimes there's so much light that I've maxed out my shutter speed and it's still too bright. And at that point, if my ISO is as low as it can go and my shutter speed is as fast as it can go, the only other option is to increase my aperture, make my aperture more narrow so that it's letting in less light. So then I'll have to bump up my aperture maybe to f3.5 or something. So, and then you just keep fiddling with that until your settings are correct and you have a well-exposed photo. Typically, you're not going to have to like go that far, but just if there's a ton of light, you might have to. Now on the flip side, let's say you're inside and say you're photographing your kids playing with some Legos. So they're not moving very fast. Again, I'll try starting with like 1/200. I'll try again probably with the aperture of like around 2.0. If I want the Legos in focus, I'll have to go higher. Maybe I'll go f4 just to keep more in focus so you can see what's going on better. Because if they're playing and the Legos are completely blurred out, you don't even know what's going on. So you might want a higher f-stop. But now you're letting in even less light. So now with your ISO, you're probably going to need ISO maybe like 1000 or 2000. And at some point you might max out your ISO, or it might be so high that your photos are really grainy looking. At that point, you might want to mess with lowering your shutter speed or lowering your aperture. And it's just this balance between the three. You're adjusting your shutter speed, ISO, aperture. My hard limit, the thing I care about the most when I'm shooting, is not making my shutter speed too slow. I don't want a slow shutter speed. If you have a blurry image, you can't use it unless it's intentional. So that's the most important thing to me. It's really important to me that I keep my limits on my shutter speed. Aperture and ISO, I'm more comfortable messing around with more because those don't have such consequences. That's really it. Those are the three things. And yeah, there's other things you can do in the future, but if you're just starting out, just focus on those three things, and then you can expand into other areas later and other settings. But once you know those three things, you can shoot manual and get the photos that you want. You can make it so that they're not blurry, they're not grainy, the aperture, the depth of field is how you want it. And yeah, it's great. So I know it's a little confusing and overwhelming at first, but just keep studying and messing around with your ISO, your aperture, and your shutter speed. And if you're on a long lens, use a faster shutter speed. And if you're on a shorter lens, you can use a slower shutter speed. A rule of thumb that I've read is to take your focal length of your lens and double it. I personally like to go even higher than that though. So if I'm shooting on a 50, they say you could do 1/100 by default, but I think it's wise to go faster than that. So I add some, but that you don't want to go less than that. So if you're on like a 200 millimeter lens, you're going to want to shoot at least 1/400 or faster. So I hope that gives you a good baseline for figuring out how to shoot in manual mode. And if you have any questions, just let me know. Don't be scared to try. Another thing you could try, just to get more comfortable, like a baby step, is you could try setting your ISO to auto mode and just mess with your shutter speed and your aperture for now, and then let the camera decide your ISO. That might be a good way just to get comfortable with shutter speed and aperture and figure those out. And then once you get comfortable with those, add in manual ISO. Just a thought. I don't know. If I'm shooting if it's like a cloudy day where the cloud is coming and going, or if I'm going from like full sun to full shade, Sometimes I will leave my camera on auto ISO because it's so hard to just keep flipping back and forth constantly. So it's not like the worst thing in the world, but generally speaking, you want to tell your camera what to do. You don't want your camera to decide what to do because your camera doesn't know what's going on and you do. So those are my thoughts and my tips, and yeah, I hope that they help you. I'll probably do another video when, I have my phone on a tripod, so I can use my hands to show things a little bit better, and I'll grab my camera. This was just like it was supposed to be quick. It's supposed to be just a little quick video about it. So yeah, anyway, let me know if you have any questions.